Hi everyone. I just finished the third chapter in the book My System by Aaron Nimzowitsch. And this chapter was all about the theory, his theory behind the seventh rank. The chapter is actually called the seventh and eighth ranks. So he's going to tell you what to do once you take control of the seventh rank. And let's have a look at this position. So white has a strong position with his two rooks on the seventh, and the black king is confined to the eighth rank here. So what white is going to try to do is get his rooks over to the h7 and g7 squares and try to flush the black king out of the corner. And you'll see how it all ends. So this is a key point that the two players are going to fight for. It's black to move, and he wants to stop white from playing rook to h7 check. So he moves his rook to the h file. So white is going to, at all costs, eject the black rook from the h file. So he starts by attacking it with his knight. Rook is forced to h5 if it wants to maintain that file. And then g4 attacks it again, which sacrifices a pawn, and black must take it if he wants to maintain the file. But then after king to g2, you'll see all the squares on the h file are covered. So finally the black rook has to leave the h file, and then white checks on h7 and flushes that king out of the corner. Now he has his knight well placed here because it's defending the g7 rook, and that's the key that allows this back rank mate. Let's have a look at this position. So here white has only one rook on the seventh, but the black king is on the eighth rank and white is going to try to mate him. He has to pick a target square. So that rook has control of that entire seventh rank right now, uncontested. But white needs to pick a square to target. And a natural looking square here is h7, which is defended twice. Maybe white can attack it 3 times and win by capturing on g7. Let's see an attempt to do that. So knight to g3, trying to reroute the knight to f5. And then maybe black's best defense here is to push his a pawn. Then knight f5 attacks g7 for a second time. Black pushes the a pawn again. The queen comes up, and now 3 pieces are attacking g7. But unfortunately, black is just in time. He queens, and his queen is actually defending g7. So white cannot successfully take on g7, and black has the better position and should win this game. So what's the correct method then at the beginning here? The correct method is actually to target the h7 square, not the g7 square. And white has to do that by violent means. He plays knight to f6 check. This forces black to clear that entire seventh rank by capturing with his pawn. What would happen if he didn't capture? Well, if he moved his king to h8, then white has a very pretty checkmate, starting with queen takes h6 check, and that forces the queen to be captured, and then rook to h7. And that's a common mating pattern to be aware of, having the rook and the knight placed like that, regardless of any other pieces on the board. That's a mate. Okay, so back to this position after knight to f6 check. Let's say black does take the knight. Okay, well that cleared the entire seventh rank, so it should be pretty easy for the white queen to get in there, and he can do it with queen to e6 check, king to h8, and then you can place your queen somewhere like queen to d7, and then mate along the seventh rank is unstoppable. Queen to h7 checkmate is coming next, and all black can do maybe is block with his bishop and delay it for a move. Okay, so let's have a look at another position where white has a rook on the 7th and he needs to bring some more firepower to attack a certain spot on the 7th rank. So here the natural spot to attack is this G7 square. It's kind of awkward to get at that G7 square though. This pawn is sort of in white's way. If that pawn weren't there, he'd be able to play a move like queen to G4 to attack that point. Let's look at a couple failed attempts. Maybe white plays his rook over to D7 with the intent of doubling rooks on the 7th rank in order to attack that. But that's simply too slow because of rook to C8 contests that C file. Another possibility white might think of is playing his rook here to C4 to block the queen's action. And so this threatens queen to F7 with a mate to follow on G7. But that's too slow too. Black can play rook to F8, protecting that F7 square. So what's the correct method here? Well, the correct method, again, is kind of explosive. It's sacrificing the rook on the G7 square. King must take, and now that whole 7th rank is kind of up for grabs. Now it's much easier for white to mate that black king. So let's say the king goes back to F8, and then queen to H6 check. There's a lot of ways to win. Even queen takes H7 here is going to win the game. But Nimzowitsch points out the most accurate way to win this is to check black as much as you can. Don't give black any tempi, just keep checking him. So queen to H6 check, king to E8, queen to E3 check, king to F8, queen to E7 check, king to G8, and then the mate. So black had no room to breathe there. All right, let's have a look at this position where, again, white has a rook on the 7th. He has total control of that 7th rank. He'd like to get the queen in to mate, and he'd like to do it quickly. Let's look at a kind of a failed attempt to see the danger in the position that black is holding. If white tries this maneuver, queen to F2 check, king over, and then takes the C5 pawn with a mating threat here on E7. Well, it doesn't work because black has the move. He pushes the pawn to E3 with check from the bishop, and either white blocks the check with the queen and loses the queen, or he moves his king over and gets mated by the rook. Okay, so that's a checkmate. So that's the danger in the position. So just like in the last position we looked at, white should try to deliver as many checks as possible, not to give black the opportunity to push this pawn and get this discovered check. So the correct method here is queen to F1 check, forcing the king over to E8, and then queen to B5 check, and then the king goes back, and now you're taking that C5 pawn again like last time, but this time you're taking it with check. So black has no time, he gets mated. Okay, so a couple definitions. In this position here, it's not an interesting position because white is clearly winning, but I just want to illustrate one of Nimzowicz's definitions, which is, he says if you have a rook on the 7th rank and your opponent's king is confined to the 8th rank and it's never going to be able to get off like that, he says that white has the 7th rank absolute. The 7th rank absolute is what white has here. And just to contrast that, take a look at this position where we move the pawn up to F7. Here, white has the 7th rank and the king is on the 8th, but we do not say that white has the 7th rank absolute because the black king is not confined to the 8th rank. His pawn allows him to escape the 8th rank, so that's not the 7th rank absolute. One of Nimzowicz's rules of thumb is if you can attain the 7th rank absolute with a far advanced passed pawn, it almost always wins, he says. And here's a good example of that. So here in this position, it's white to move. He does not have the 7th rank absolute because this pawn is here and the king can escape out. But that's of no matter because white is going to play a forcing line. He's going to take the bishop with check. Okay, and he's threatening the rook on e6, so black has nothing but to block it with the rook. And that pins the queen to the king, so white has to give the queen up for the rook. But now that the pawn has moved off of g7, white does have this 7th rank absolute, and he pushes his pawn to b6, and that's a sufficiently advanced passed pawn. This is also a passed pawn, and that's also the 7th rank absolute, but white's pawn is much more advanced than black's pawn. White is winning here, and it's a good rule of thumb just to know without having to calculate it. So Nimzowitsch just knows that this is winning, and let's just explain why. Well, black has to contain the pawn, so he has to put his rook behind it. But then the pawn pushes to b7, and this king is still confined to the 8th rank because if it ever comes forward, then white queens the pawn with a check, okay, and wins the game that way. So what can black do? Well, white has a threat in the position. His threat is to play rook to a8 check, followed by queening. Okay, so black has nothing to do here. All he can do maybe is check the white king, and one plan is to get out of that by just approaching the rook. And once you get close to the rook, then there are no more checks, and then white follows through with the check, followed by queening, and then it's an easy win from here. White does have to be careful and calculate that he can stop the pawn, which in this case is easy to do. Okay, so another idea that Nimzowitsch talks about in this chapter is getting a perpetual check on the 7th rank. And in this position, white would really love to get a perpetual check because his king is in so much danger. It's facing a mate and 1. Rook to h1 would be mate right away. It's white's move and he wants to get a perpetual. Now, this example is designed to keep you aware of the right and wrong ways to get the perpetual check here. It seems like you have free reign to check with your rooks along the 7th rank all you want, but you don't. The black bishop has control of that square. So a blunder would be this move. If you move that rook there, then black's going to win this game. You can't get a perpetual check because the black king will keep moving to the left here until it gets to b8, and then you have no more checks. No more safe checks here, and you just can't handle the mate threat. So that's the wrong way to get the perpetual. The correct way is with this rook, and then just keep that rook fixed there the whole time, and no matter what black does here, just keep checking him with this same rook. And you could go wrong. You can say, oh, for variety, let me check with the other rook. No, that's already a mistake. Again, you can't do that because this king now is going to escape all the way to the b8 square. So be careful how you get that perpetual. Another type of perpetual utilizing the 7th rank occurs with a rook and a knight. So let's see how white can save the game here. Black has these 3 passed pawns ready to queen, so white needs this perpetual. A mistake is to try to get it now. Check. By the way, the king has 2 squares to go to, and it's not very productive to go this way, because after this check, the king is forced back. Because remember, if it goes here, you got that mate we talked about? So it just forces him right back. So after this check, black king would run that way. And after this check, again, the black king doesn't want to go back and repeat. He'll move that way. And now white has run out of useful checks. I mean, he can let him off the back rank, or he can do this and let him over there, and he doesn't have his perpetual. So what's the way for white to save this game? Well, another good rule of thumb to remember is this move right here. Placing that rook exactly 1 knight's move away from that knight on f6. Now, why does that work? Well, let's suppose black queens one of his pawns here now. Now white has his perpetual. There's check, check. Remember, this leads to a mate. So he goes back here. There's check. Goes over here. There's check protecting the rook. He goes back here, and he just cannot get out of this perpetual check. So it's useful to remember that rook being one move away from that knight like that. Okay, here's another interesting example where we put a black rook on c8 from the last position. And it's white to move again, and he wants his perpetual check. This time, moving the rook to d7 is just too slow. For example, black can play this move and attack the knight, so there's no more perpetual. We'll just snap up the knight. So what's the correct move here? Well, with the rook on c8, white already has his perpetual set up. Let's see. Check. If he goes over here, check. He's just forced back. Here, let's say he goes this way, check. If he goes over here, he's repeating. And if he goes over here, he's mated. Okay, he's mated because of that rook. It's the same kind of mate we saw in the corner here on h when the king was on h8. So that rook is unfortunately placed there and allows this perpetual. Okay, let's have a look at this position. So another topic Nimzowitsch talks about in this chapter is, and we saw this actually in the first position of the video, is getting your rooks over to the edges here on the G and H file and flushing this king out, and using a piece. If you get your rooks on G7 and H7, you can use another piece, like perhaps this knight, to protect the G7 rook so that you can push this H rook to H8 with a mate. Let's see how it's done. So first, white tries to get his rooks over into the G and H files. And right there, after rook to H7, that's a mate threat. Rook to H8 would be mate. So that forces the black king to go back to G8. And then this rook comes here, forcing the king over. And now, if this rook were protected, then rook to H8 would be mate. There's actually a couple ideas that Nimzowitsch talks about in positions like this. One idea is if you had the possibility of checking this black king with another piece, like let's say you had a bishop move, you can move here and check him, then you can force him over and do the mate. But if you don't, like we don't in this case have the ability to check him, then you can try to support that rook. And how should white do that here? Well, he should move knight to G5 with the threat of putting the knight on E6, protecting the rook and mating on H8. So what can black do about it? Well, we'll look at two moves. If he takes the knight, then it's actually the pawn that comes up and protects the rook on G7. And then no matter what black does here, the next move is rook to H8 mate. So he can't take the knight. So what can he do about this threat? Well, the only other possibility is pushing the D pawn to guard that threat with the bishop. But then white can play that anyway, and black's forced to trade, and now this pawn is not going to be protecting that rook, but now we see another theme that Nimzowitsch explores. This pawn wants to go to E7 and check that black king. So in fact, let's say black just makes some inconsequential move like rook to B3. Well, then E7 check forces the king over, and then you can put one of your rooks, it doesn't matter which, on the 8th rank and flush that king out. And then you queen the pawn, and notice that's a double check. That's important, so black can't take the queen. That's illegal. So that's going to easily win. That's going to be a mate very soon. There's really no other move. All moves are kind of inconsequential here. The only thing black can try, really, is playing his rook to E8, so that if white pushes the pawn, he takes it. But then white just gains a rook, and this ending is pretty easy for white to win anyway. All right, let's have a look at one more idea that occurs when you have a pair of rooks on the 7th rank. So this idea, we don't have any other pieces to support one of the rooks to get a mate like in the last position. We don't have a pawn to queen, but we can threaten a back rank mate and gain a tempo. So the way that works is rook H7 check, force that king over to the F8 square like this, and then you can grab a pawn, separate your rooks. So this is a threat of rook to h8 mate. And the only way out of that is moving the king back. I suppose you can move it here, but then you're just going to give white another tempo to run away and threaten the mate again. So the king goes back to g8, and then we repeat. We check it, push it on f8 again, and we take the next pawn. This reminds me of a tactic called the windmill. I don't think this is considered a windmill, though. Windmill is usually done with, I think, a rook and a bishop is the usual way of doing a windmill. But anyway, that's a mate threat there, so it's going to force the king back to g8, and we repeat, check, we take the next pawn. King goes back, and by the way, here it would be a mistake to take the knight, hoping for rook takes rook and rook takes rook, because if white takes the knight, black's just going to queen, and the queen and the rook protect each other. So white has to repeat again, and this time he takes the knight, threatening the mate, and the king could go back, or either way, white's going to be up a rook, or black can take that rook, and then white contains this a pawn. So that's a way to gain a tempo, is to keep threatening that mate there. And finally, the last position we'll look at is a game that Nimzowitsch played. He had the white pieces, and this is a good example of having the 7th rank absolute with a far advanced passed pawn. So Nimzowitsch is white, and his opponent is on the move, and he plays rook to f8, with the idea of pushing the pawn to f6 and trying to trade a pair of pawns. Material is equal in this game. White has some far advanced passed pawns, though, that look pretty dangerous, and white's king is more active, and black's king is restricted to this back rank. Okay, so white just takes that pawn on b4, and black goes ahead with his plan, pushes his pawn to f6, but then white disturbs that rook with this bishop move. And it turns out black cannot maintain this file with rook to f7, because rook to b7 is going to win the game. This is going to force a trade here, and then white gets these two passed pawns, and black's bishop can't stop them both. So after the bishop comes to c5 to attack this rook, the rook is forced to leave that f file. Best move is rook to c8 to attack the bishop, but then Nimzowitsch takes the pawn on f6 and sacrifices his bishop. Okay, and then plays f7, forcing the rook back, and then gets this rook on the 7th rank, and he has the 7th rank absolute. The black king is trapped back there, and he has more than one far advanced passed pawn, which more than makes up for the fact that he's down a bishop. So let's see how it ends. Okay, bishop d3. White's plan is to bring this rook over to e7 and then go to e8 so he can queen his pawn. And so bishop to d3 was designed to stop that idea. So the bishop is coming back in time to protect that square. But white just brings his king up, king to f4. I'll point out rook to e8 here would be a mistake. Black should take the rook with his bishop, and then if white tries to be sneaky and queen the pawn behind the bishop, well, there's a discovered attack on the queen with a check here. So white loses the queen anyway. Okay, so white just brings the king up, king f4, rook h8, pawn goes to h7. Black can't take it, or white's going to queen his f-pawn. Bishop to a4. Black can do nothing here as he watches white bring his king up, and here black resigns. Okay, so good game by Nimzowitsch, good application of that 7th rank absolute. All right, I really enjoyed that 3rd chapter. I'm looking forward to reading more of this book. Thanks for watching the video.